Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a pretty vast and complex subject, building the necessary digital public infrastructure, DPI, specifically for the agricultural sector. There's just a staggering amount of information out there about this shift, and it can feel overwhelming. But it's so critical because, well, it deals directly with global food security. So our mission today is really to cut through some of that noise. We spent a lot of time immersing ourselves in this crucial expert e-conversation, the one that happened right before the National Agricultural Digital Infrastructure Policy Guide, or NAgDI, was released. We're going to try and pull out the core insights on how this framework actually functions. Not just the tech, but, the whole systemic approach to modernizing agriculture.
Yeah, and I think we absolutely have to start with a really fundamental distinction that came up right away in the conversation. NAgDI.
Yeah.
It's not actually DPI itself. It definitely uses the principles of DPI, things like interoperability, consent, open standards. But the experts, they really define AgDI as a comprehensive delivery approach.
A delivery approach.
Right. One of the key architects, Guptiji, put it quite beautifully, I thought. He said, the body cannot exist without the soul. So NAgDI is kind of the physical infrastructure, the body, but it's built entirely on the soul of those DPI principles.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that a little because DPI, as many understand it, often focuses on those core tech components, right? The protocols, the identity layers. But agriculture is just inherently messy, isn't it? It's diverse, it's heavily regulated. So if NAgDI is this expanded body, as you say, going beyond just the core tech, why? What does that expanded part actually look like?
Well, that expansion is exactly why the experts define NAgDI as having four interconnected components, not just, the tech bit. You've got the technologies and systems. Sure, that's the core DPI layer we're talking about. But the point is that cannot function on its own without three other layers that are just essential for agriculture.
Okay, what are they?
So first, you absolutely need policies and principles. Second, you need governance and administration. And finally, critically, a marketing and business model. And the key insight here is that these are elevated really to the same level of importance as the technology itself.
Okay, I get why tech and a business model are crucial, but why make policies and principles an actual infrastructure component? Isn't that just, background paperwork or regulation?
That's a great question. Because in agriculture, the tech part is often relatively straightforward to implement compared to building trust. Think about it. If NAgDI allows for this mass exchange of sensitive data, farmer yields, soil health info, maybe financial history, you need absolutely ironclad policies. Policies on consent, on data ownership, and especially on liability if something goes wrong. So these policies, they act like the regulatory guardrails. They're what make the underlying technology trusted and therefore usable by everyone involved, farmers, governments, private companies.
Yeah.
Without that trust, nobody's going to upload their data, are they?
Right.
And then the whole infrastructure just fails.
That makes complete sense. Yeah, it really shifts NAgDI from just being a technical stack to a truly systemic framework. So, okay, let's talk about the payoff then. If we manage to build this four-pronged infrastructure, what did the experts identify as the main sort of macro-level use cases? What's the big win?
Well, the consensus, and this was driven quite strongly by Ben Adams' input in the conversation, really focused on the immediate need for sophisticated data analytics tools and AI-enabled services. I mean, every sector is jumping on AI, but for smallholder agriculture, the real benefits, things like truly personalized advisory services or instant credit scoring, they remain largely theoretical. And that's because we haven't solved the fundamental problem. All of the data is scattered and locked away.
And that is the current reality, isn't it? Smallholder farm data is just trapped in countless different silos, often controlled by individual companies using their own proprietary systems. There's no interoperability. So if that data stays locked up and fragmented, yeah, those high-quality, customized AI services the experts talked about, they become, what was the word they used? A mirage.
Precisely. A mirage.
Yeah.
And a functional NAgDI is designed specifically to be the solvent for those silos. It's expected to make large volumes of, importantly, validated data sets available and accessible. And crucially, only with consent from the data owner, using sophisticated data exchange technologies.
Can you give us an example of how that might work in practice?
Sure. Let's imagine a digital agriculture service provider based in northern Uganda. They want to improve their AI models to give really accurate, localized advice to farmers there, but maybe they only have good data for their specific region. Now, with the functional NAgDI system using its structured exchange, they could potentially access in near real-time validated data sets from other partners, maybe ones operating way down in the southern part of the country. And they could do this without having to spend a fortune on collecting all that southern data themselves. It strengthens their models immediately.
Wow, okay, that economic benefit alone seems huge. Accessing validated data at, what, a fraction of the cost of collecting it yourself, that could fundamentally change the game for private sector innovation and ag tech. But hang on, that raises a key question for me. If you have this independent, maybe government-mandated entity managing the rules, the tech, the revenue from data exchange, how do you make sure that entity stays neutral and focused on the public good? Isn't there a risk you just create another kind of bottleneck or, a high-level silo itself?
That's a critical concern, absolutely. And it's exactly why the experts elevated governance and administration to be one of those core infrastructure components, not just an afterthought. The mandate for this governing body isn't just about setting fees or managing the tech platform. It's got to be about establishing transparency, creating really effective ways to resolve disputes, when things go wrong. And crucially, ensuring that any revenue generated from the data exchange gets plowed back into maintaining and improving the infrastructure itself. That helps prevent NAgDI from becoming perpetually dependent on government handouts, or worse, vulnerable to being captured by special interests.
Okay, so the governance is key to keeping it a public good. And you mentioned earlier, NDI is the tool set for the service providers. It's not the direct service to the farmer itself. Which takes us nicely to that powerful analogy Krishan Pinnick used. He reframed NDI as being like a road, but a road specially adapted for agricultural use. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's a great analogy because it makes it very tangible.
It's not just any old road, is it? He described it as like a specialized road. It needed to be wide enough for two of those huge sugarcane trucks to pass each other safely. It needed frequent laybys, places for tractors to pull over and load. It needed a really large turning radius for the long-hauling trucks and gradual slopes so that fully loaded vehicles could actually manage the hills without tipping over or stalling.
Exactly. And what makes the analogy so perfect is how he immediately connected those physical requirements back to the non-physical infrastructure components we talked about. So the wide lanes, the turning radius, the laybys, that's like the technology and systems part. But the gradual slopes, the rules about vehicle size limits, those represent the accompanying set of policy regulations and governing rules. And the toll booth, if you like, managed fairly and reinvesting its revenue, that's the business model. The whole system, physical and non-physical, has to be specialized for the heavy load and the unique needs of agriculture to actually work effectively.
Right, the infrastructure has to be customized and comprehensive. It makes sense. But setting up something this robust, this specialized, it leads directly to that classic implementation challenge, doesn't it? The chicken and egg problem. Charles Diwa, in the discussion, argued that maybe we need to focus first on proving the value right down at the local farmer level, demonstrate the benefits clearly there, before we start advocating for these large-scale NAgDI rollouts.
Yeah, and that feels intuitively right, doesn't it? Start small, prove it works.
Yeah.
But Christian's counterargument was really fascinating. He basically suggested that by properly documenting and sharing success stories, the benefits of DPI that have already been seen in other contexts or other countries, we can gain what he called a skip straight to raising the chicken capability. His point was, humans don't necessarily need to break every single egg themselves to understand the value of eventually getting a chicken. We can learn from others' experiences and move more directly to implementing NAgDI with a reasonable expectation of success.
That's quite a philosophical leap, though. It really demands strict, careful planning if you're going to skip those initial small-scale proofs. You can't just build the fancy agricultural road and assume the specialized trucks will magically appear and use it correctly. So how did the experts suggest prioritizing implementation once, say, a government decides, okay, we're going to build NAgDI? Where do you start?
That's where Pralsa and Cook came in with a really excellent, practical, four-step prioritization framework. It's designed to move the whole process from just philosophical intent to actual, actionable planning. It forces planners to think systemically.
Okay, what are the steps?
Step one is, consider the expected changes. And the key here is that planners need to look way beyond just, say, increasing crop yields. The real transformative potential often lies in enabling completely new value chains, things like carbon valuation for sustainable practices, maybe water credit trading, definitely improved insurability for smallholders, or better fintech integration deep into the processing supply chain.
Right, thinking bigger than just production. And step two, that addresses where in the system that change should ideally start, doesn't it?
Exactly. Step two is consider where in the food system change could occur fastest, or perhaps easiest. The experts generally noted that opportunities post-farm gate might be quicker wins. Think about streamlining processing efficiencies, improving logistics and traceability, or tracking the origin of high-value export crops. These often involve fewer, larger players who might already be more technologically savvy. That might be quicker to develop and show success compared to pre-farm gate solutions, which often require immediate, potentially disruptive changes in practice by millions of individual, often resource-poor farmers.
That makes sense. Start where you can get traction fastest. But you said there were 4 steps. Steps 3 and 4 sound like they get to the heart of financial sustainability.
Absolutely crucial. Step 3 is identify precisely how the digital infrastructure creates value. This is the core value proposition. What problem does it solve and for whom? If NAgDI enables, say, much cheaper access to vital data for service providers, that's clear value. If it allows for new microinsurance products because farmer data can be reliably verified, that's value. But the value proposition can't be vague. It has to be clear and tangible.
Okay, identify the value. And the last step.
And finally, step 4, which honestly is often the most neglected part in these kinds of initiatives. Consider how, and crucially by whom, that generated value will actually be captured. Think about it. If the government tries to capture all the value through excessive fees or taxes, private companies simply won't invest in building services on top of NAgDI. Conversely, if private companies capture all the value and don't share benefits downstream, why would farmers bother participating or sharing their data? So the implementation planning absolutely must ensure a balanced value capture mechanism to keep everyone invested and participating long-term.
This structured approach really moves the conversation far beyond just theory, doesn't it? And it's worth reminding ourselves, the experts did point to several successful foundational cases already out there, places like Belize, Benin, Malawi, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Lao PDR. And they also mentioned Afkar Mali's Agricultural Digitization Center, which I believe has been running since way back in 2018. So the core ideas have definitely been tested in the real world.
Yeah, and to ground this planning process even more in real-world data, Sander Janssen shared some really critical lessons learned from the AgroDataCube experience over in the Netherlands. Now, AgroDataCube isn't exactly NGI, but it provides a pretty high-level analogy for implementing this kind of complex data-sharing infrastructure in a sophisticated agricultural setting.
What was the key takeaway there?
What was really fascinating was that once the core infrastructure, the DataCube, was actually up and running, use cases started emerging that they hadn't even foreseen initially. For example, they ended up developing simple websites that allowed individual farmers to go in and visually inspect their own soil health status or see visualizations of sustainability indicators for their specific plots. This was information they hadn't necessarily realized they needed or could even get until it suddenly became instantly accessible through the infrastructure.
Okay, but here's the part that really jumped out at me from that AgroDataQ experience. Because for policymakers, for financial planners trying to budget for NAgDI, this finding is, well, it's seismic. Sander detailed the finding on the adoption time specifically for applications that required a change in farmer behavior. Things like the environmental applications, helping farmers figure out how to produce with less environmental burden.
Yes, this was striking.
It took farmers not just a few months, but a full 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 years of sustained learning just to properly understand the new digital information being presented to them. And then, crucially, another layer of time to actually integrate that knowledge and act on it by changing their long-established farming practices.
That time lag, that 2 to 3 year gap. It carries a really profound implication for how we plan these things. It has huge consequences for timelines. Because if it takes that long just for the end user, the farmer, to adopt and apply the new knowledge from one application, then any subsequent applications built on top of NAgDI, maybe new fintech products leveraging that data, or carbon valuation schemes, they're going to be delayed by that same period, right? The typical policy cycle and the messy reality of human behavior change are just fundamentally mismatched. This finding basically forces governments and planners to realize they need to start building the core infrastructure elements, the policies, the governance structures, the rules of the road now, years in advance.
That really is the true definition of infrastructure, isn't it? Things you have to build long before the most obvious benefits start rolling in. It also sounds like the experts recognized a pretty significant governance gap here, too. We have these highly integrated systems, like the National Met Offices, the meteorological services, that provide standardized weather models and data for forecasting across entire regions. It's accepted, it works, but we currently lack anything comparable, that same kind of integrated data supply system and consistent governance framework for critical agricultural data.
That's a very accurate summary of the gap, yes.
So wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you, our listener?
Well, this entire deep dive into the e-conversation really confirms that NAgDI isn't just some optional technology add-on. It's really being framed as an essential systemic approach. It successfully expands the basic DPI concept to combine the technology with the vital layers of policy, governance, and viable business models, all needed to support those macro-level high-value use cases like sophisticated AI-enabled services that can benefit the entire agricultural supply chain, not just the farm gate.
And I think the key takeaways for anyone involved in implementation really boil down to two things: patience and precision planning. Implementation absolutely has to be prioritized using something like Prof. Cook's four-step process, especially focusing hard on defining the value proposition and figuring out who captures that value fairly. And at the same time, planners have to acknowledge and build in that non-negotiable 2 to 3 year lag time required for genuine farmer adoption and, more importantly, applied knowledge. Getting the governance structure and that independent entity's business model right from the start is probably just as important, maybe even more so, than perfecting the underlying code.
That really sets the stage for the next phase of development, doesn't it? So we'll leave you with the final provocative thought that emerged from the expert community, one that builds directly on this need for coordinated action. How would you see the role of major international bodies, like the Commonwealth or the NAgDI community of practice itself, in supporting the necessary collaboration models? The models required for the complex cross-border planning, and, crucially, the equitable implementation of this expanded digital infrastructure. Something for you to chew on until our next deep dive.